This the date at which each of the 4 New Testament Gospels was written, and what this means in terms of the writers of the Gospels and their reliability. Now, there's been a number of different dates proposed for the Gospels, mainly without supporting evidence. But in this video, we're going to look at the evidence, and we're going to see where this takes us. So subscribe, hit the like button, and off we go. So start off by looking at the possible time scale in which the Gospels can be written. We start off with the resurrection. That may have happened in 30 AD or 33 AD. I'm going to pick 30 AD. That's my preference. Other people like 33. The next event to think about, really made a big difference, was the Jewish War. Starts in 66 AD, reaches a climax in 70 AD when Jerusalem is destroyed and pretty much flattened, and the temple is completely destroyed. First it's burned down, and then after that it gets properly destroyed. Just before that, in 64 AD, there's a great fire in Rome, which begins a persecution of Christians, and that also changes the way that Christians think of the world around them. And these are going to be sort of fixed points that help to date the Gospels and other New Testament writings. Skeptics tend to put the date of the New Testament pretty late. So they will put it in the middle to the end of the 2nd century AD. And you'll find this sort of thing is around on the internet, not hugely supported by evidence, but it's there. The other end of the scale, we have people talking about early dates. These would date the New Testament before 70 AD. And what you get in most textbooks is some kind of compromise between the two. But what this really is definitely not based on evidence. It's based on how late you can put things before the people who go for early dates start to complain, and how early you can get it before the people who want to have the late dates start to complain. So it's a political compromise rather than something supported by evidence. Late dates tend to come from very radical skeptics. The early dates, interestingly, come from the more recently published dating studies, and the middle dates, well, they're a compromise. So let's look at some of the evidence we got around. The kind of evidence, well, the obvious and clearest kind of evidence you can get is the physical evidence. It's the evidence of a manuscript. If you actually find a copy of part of the New Testament and a copy of, say, the Gospel of Luke, then you know that the Gospel of Luke must have been written before that copy was made. So that absolutely fixes a date for the latest possible time for the composition of the New Testament. And you can do the same thing again by looking at places where the New Testament is quoted by early writers. On top of that, you've got the way that the New Testament talks about the world around it. So it will refer to customs, geographical points, to buildings, things like that. The building was destroyed, and the New Testament talks about it. After a while, people would forget. So you've got something that tells you what the date of the place where that was written happens to be. And finally, you've got internal references. You've got places where the New Testament gives you evidence which helps it to date itself. And we look at all 4 of those different kinds of evidence. So let's start off with manuscript evidence. This is a papyrus fragment. It's known as the Rylands fragment. It's also got a number. It's P52. It's in the University Library in Manchester, United Kingdom. And it's a little bit of John's Gospel. And you can date it by looking at the handwriting. Handwriting changes from decade to decade, but you probably can't date it that well. Certainly you can date it to half a century and probably better than that. This one's been particularly carefully looked at, and the closest comparisons are actually from the late 1st century or the very, very early 2nd century. People don't tend to date it as late as the best comparisons. They tend to say, probably a bit later than that. It's Codex after all, the others were scrolls, but certainly we'll put it early on in the 2nd century, and the dates that are given anywhere between 90 AD, which fits the handwriting, and 140 AD, somewhere around that time. And you can say the Gospel of John must have been written at the time that that was copied, and probably quite a long time before that, because this isn't the autograph. It's not the original copy. It's not a copy of a copy. Probably it's probably 3 or 4 generations on. So that puts the Gospel of John back into the 1st century. Here's another papyrus fragment. It's P90. This is discovered in Oxyrhynchus in Egypt. And again, it's part of John's Gospel. And it's completely datable to the 2nd century. It's quite a broad date within that, but generally put around 150 AD, plus or minus 25 years. And this one, this is P66, and it's an almost complete Gospel of John. There are a few pages missing, and some of the pages are worn at the bottom. So it's not absolutely complete, but it shows that you've got pretty much the whole of the Gospel of John, and that's generally accepted to have date from the end of the 2nd century, just possibly to go into the 3rd century, but more likely the end of the 2nd century AD. Nice and readable. It's a good copy of the Gospel of John. So let's put those on our time scale. P66, there it is. It's at the end of the 2nd century. The Gospel of John must have been written before then. You put in P90, then that's somewhere in the middle of the century. It's got a bit of a broad range of dates to it, but it's giving some kind of picture as to when the Gospel of John might have been written. And here we've got P52, which is earlier still. And basically what these are doing is they're wiping out the late dates. The Gospel of John has to have been written in the 1st century from physical evidence. What else have we got? Well, another thing we've got is people quoting the Gospels. So let's think about some writers who quoted from the New Testament. There's Irenaeus of Lyon, who quotes pretty well every book in the New Testament, very keen on saying that there are exactly 4 Gospels and naming them and so on. There's no doubt that everything was in existence by his time. But we can go earlier than him. Muratorian fragment, probably just a tiny little bit earlier than Irenaeus, although this is a very disputed in terms of dates. But that gives a list of books in the New Testament. It's not complete, so we don't have every book that it lists. But it says that the 3rd Gospel was Luke and the 4th Gospel was John, and it lists a lot of Paul's letters as well. And, well, they were in existence when the Muratorian fragment was first written. Unfortunately, what we have isn't the original. It's a copy of it, and it's only fragmentary. Justin Martyr, another writer, writing around 150 AD, and he quotes from wide range of New Testament books. We know that they were written by the time Justin Martyr was writing. And here we've got another one even earlier than that, a man called Polycarp. He quotes from 3 of the Gospels. He quotes from the Synoptic Gospels. Strangely, doesn't quote from the Gospel of John. That's his choice. But we got 3 Gospels definitely written by the time Polycarp is working. Ignatius of Antioch, he's being taken to Rome as part of a persecution. He's going to be put to death there. And he quotes extensively from the New Testament. He quotes all the Gospels as well. And then the earliest one I've got is Clement of Rome. Now, it's a bit of a problem because he definitely quotes some of the Paul's letters, and he appears to quote the Gospel of Matthew. Problem is that the Greek wording isn't quite the same as that in the actual Gospel of Matthew. If you get the English translations, they're the same. You see, it's Matthew, not Luke, it's not Mark, it's Matthew. But the Greek wording is a bit different. And the usual thought here is that what he's doing is he's quoting from a Latin translation of Matthew, which is translating back into Greek. So it looks as though Matthew existed at the time that Clement of Rome was writing his letter, and that Clement of Rome had access to a Latin translation of it. That's jolly early. But whether the Clement bit's right or not, the rest of them show that the late dates don't really fit. Okay, let's look at accuracy of reference. Archaeology gives us a picture of what things are like, and we can compare that with what's there in the Gospels. Now, the important thing here is the Jewish war. You're getting a reference in the Gospels to things that happened in Judea or in Galilee, then those things changed. In 68 AD, the Roman army swept through Galilee and came down towards Jerusalem. A bit of a pause in 69. 70, they finished the job off. Almost every village in the area was destroyed. Jerusalem was absolutely flattened. Other towns had a seriously bad time of it. The people were taken away and made slaves, sent to Delos, to the slave market there, and distributed throughout the Roman Empire. So, well, for a long time, the place was desolate. It's only really in the 2nd century that it gets a large number of people resettling there. Some Jews did come back, they had another revolt, and it gets cleared even more. But the details of life that were happening before the Jewish war would rapidly be forgotten after the war, particularly as you're talking about a totally different set of people who are writing the Gospels, if they're writing late. So you can compare the details in the Gospel with what the archaeologists know about this Second Temple period, the period before the Jewish war. And what we find is that the Gospels are accurate even in detail. Here's an example. It's an example from the Gospel of John, chapter 2, and it's part of the miracle of the turning of water into wine. It describes where the water was. It says there were 6 stone water jars there for holding the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. The important detail here is that the water jars were made of stone. Now, that's pretty uncommon. If you go to an archaeological site almost anywhere in the Mediterranean from Italy eastward, you'll find huge numbers of jars being dug up. They call them pithoi. They are almost invariably made of earthenware, almost never made of stone. Reason, earthenware is a lot cheaper to make. You can make it a potter's wheel. You just form it. You don't have to chip away the inside, turn it on a lathe, and lose all the chips. You can use just enough clay to make the jar. But it turns out that in Judea and in Galilee, people used stone water jars, but only for a short period, only for the Second Temple period. After 70 AD, they stopped doing it. It fitted nicely with Jewish law and cleanness regulations. It was easy to keep a stone jar clean than a pottery jar. Pottery jar might have to become unclean, have to be broken, got rid of. Stone water jar could be cleaned out and then used again. So this detail of stone water jars shows a knowledge of the customs of Judea and Galilee, in this particular case Galilee, at the time when Jesus was living there. You've got other evidence. You can look, by the way, in some of the other videos on Gospel Online, links up. These show some of the detail that we've got. Now, the language is an interesting one because you can see that while a large chunk of the Gospels is composed in Greek, some bits are reporting something which is comes from an Aramaic background. So Jesus sometimes teaches people in Aramaic, even possibly in Hebrew, rather than in Greek. The people who read the Gospels in Greek. They wouldn't, if you're making it up, they wouldn't be able to invent these Aramaic structures to go underneath. So what we're doing is we're seeing a reporting of things that go on in an Aramaic culture. Soon after the 70 AD war, then the Aramaic background would vanish. So the linguistic evidence puts the Gospels into this pre-70 AD milieu. It puts it into a society that's before the Jewish war. And another thing which talks about detail is the idea of undesigned coincidences. There's more than one video on that on this channel, and there's others coming up. And here we've got insignificant details in the narrative, and you can then compare them with another insignificant and independent detail, and you can find that there's something else going on that isn't referred to in the main story, but you've got this sort of little underneath narrative which is going on. And those give you evidence that you're getting something that's very accurate, even in detail. Again, if the Gospels are written late, things will be forgotten. These undesigned coincidences would vanish from the text. So the Gospels contain accurate details which would tend to be forgotten after 70 AD, and yet there they are. So we're talking about Gospels that look as though they fit into this pre-70 AD period. So the Gospels are accurate in detail, and again, the dates from the radical skeptics are definitely wiped out. They're far too late. These details wouldn't be remembered that long. And even the compromise dates don't seem to fit very well with this very accurate picture of what was going on in Galilee and in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus. The things are remembered just for too long to be accurately reported if the dates are that long. Therefore, they're reported somewhat earlier. So let's just summarize the external evidence we've seen. We've seen the manuscript evidence. We've got ancient manuscripts that put the New Testament documents into the 1st century AD. We have ancient quotations. We've got quotations by ancient writers which place the New Testament in the 1st century AD. We've got accuracy of detail that we could check, and the New Testament contains accurate details which would be forgotten soon after 70 AD. So that shows a date from before 70 AD. So all this external evidence places the New Testament not just before 100 AD, but before 70 AD. Now, it'd be interesting to know whether I made a good case there. I'd be really grateful if you could put something in the comments that would tell me what you think of the case that I've been making so far, whether you think that's a good one or not. So let's look now at some of the internal details. And this one's quite an interesting one. The Gospel of Matthew talks about the temple. It talks about people swearing oaths by the temple. Now, that's something that happened when the temple was standing, but the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, and a bit after that, people stopped swearing oaths by the temple. There's no point in swearing an oath by something that no longer exists. And so that's something that vanished after 70 AD. So there's an assumption that the temple is still standing when Matthew's Gospel is written. And it contains rules, perhaps the wrong word, principles about how you should offer a gift at the altar. Which altar? Well, there were plenty of altars around in pagan temples, but No one that was a Jew or a Christian would go and swear an oath there or leave a gift there. And so what this is assuming is that there's an altar, and the only altar that people would leave a gift at would be the altar at the temple of God in Jerusalem. But that vanished in 70 AD. So again, we're talking about something that assumes the temple's still standing, and that puts the Gospel of Matthew before 70 AD. Here's another one. Matthew 27, talking about death of Judas Iscariot and what happens. The field that Judas dies in is bought as a burial place for strangers, and it's been called the Field of Blood to this day, says Matthew. Now, that means that the name of the field was still known when Matthew wrote his gospel. Well, it wouldn't happen after 70 AD. In the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, a large number of Roman soldiers surrounded the city, more than one legion of them, and they sat there for quite a long time. They cut down all the trees. If they're big enough trees, they used the wood to make siege engines. They also needed wood for cooking, so they made campfires, and very soon all the wood for miles around the city had been burned. That included fences, hedges, any kind of bush, any kind of field boundary. They're all destroyed as part of the siege works. That even if there were stones that were used to mark the edge, they'd be picked up and used to make walls to go around the city. So no one would be able to remember what a particular thing, where it was, a particular field, let alone what it was called after 70 AD. So again, we've got this picture of a gospel that is written before 70 AD. Matthew's gospel before 70 AD. Do the same sort of thing for John's gospel. Not quite so much information, but there's quite a bit. And here's one passage from John chapter 5. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda. And there's a picture of what the pool was like. It had 5 colonnades around it. We dug it up, found there were 5 colonnades. It's one of these details that was remembered. But the interesting point about it is it doesn't say there was, it says there is in Jerusalem. So when John wrote his gospel, he believed that this pool was still there. It was still standing. The colonnades were still there. But in 70 AD, Jerusalem was completely destroyed, and this pool with it, and everybody knew about that. It was put on the coinage. Judea has been captured. There's a coin of Vespasian. It was on the coins of Titus, and even Domitian wasn't actually there. But that was circulated all around the empire. Everybody knew that the Jews had been defeated. They'd been made captives, and Jerusalem had been completely destroyed. So John's gospel also must have been written before 70 AD. The other thing that happens is that in July 64 AD, there was a great big fire in Rome, burnt through the city and destroyed a huge chunk of it. Some people estimate about half the buildings in Rome were gutted by the fire. A huge catastrophe. And initially, people blamed that on the Emperor Nero, who wanted to clear ground so he could build a palace. And Nero didn't like being blamed for it, so he decided to push off the blame onto the Christians. And there we go. That's one of the Roman historians. He's not the only one. Several Roman historians report this. But Nero started a persecution of Christians as a result of this fire in Rome. And there's a description of it, which is quite an unpleasant thing to read. Other people also confirm these really terrible details of how the Christians were persecuted. There are others who just say, oh, when they persecuted some Christians, they don't care. But the point is that this persecution started, well, there's a preparation for it for a few months after the fire, but by 65 AD, Christians were being rounded up and put to death. This persecution of Christians carried on up until the reign of Constantine in the 4th century. So suddenly there's a change in the relationship between the Roman Empire and Christian Church. The two change completely. So think about the passages we've got in the New Testament. There you are, from Hebrews chapter 12. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. Couldn't say that. In 65 AD onwards, they were shedding their blood in great quantities in 65 AD. In Peter, who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good? 1 Peter almost certainly being written as the preparations for the persecution are taking place, that people rounding up beasts to put in the arena so you can feed it, Christians to them, and they're collecting together the wood so they can crucify some, and so on. But at this point, Peter is writing, no one's going to harm you if you're doing good. That wouldn't be true 6 months later. Don't be surprised at the fire trail when it comes upon you. He's talking about something in the future. There's going to be a persecution, but it's not started yet. And so we've got this picture in all these passages of a persecution to come, but one that hasn't started yet. So if you think what the background is like in the Gospels and Acts, they show a completely different picture of Rome. There's sort of benign indifference. So in Acts, Paul sometimes is rescued by Romans from persecution by other people. More often than not, they just don't want to know about it. There's no hint of persecution. Jesus can be asked to heal a centurion's servant. There isn't this picture of persecution at all. It's not from the Romans, but it all changes. 65 AD, and it's changed. So again, we've got a picture which fits an earlier period. So we're saying Acts and the Gospels were written before 65 AD. Now we can get a lot more detail than that. This is another chronology. This time we're just covering the period from 30 to 70 AD. And what you can do is you can go through Acts and the letters of the Apostle Paul and Peter, and you can put together a very sound chronology. You can find out, you can work out where Paul was at particular times. If someone says, where was Paul in April 55 AD? You know, he was in Ephesus. He's getting ready to start leaving. He's going to leave Ephesus at Pentecost. There are a few people, I'm one of them, who have done in-depth chronological studies of Acts and the letters, and they fit together really very well. Interestingly, most of the people who will tell you the Gospels were written late won't have done this study. And you can put the letters into that, often to within a month or so. So Galatians, for example, it's either written very late in 47 AD, as Paul returns from his first missionary journey. That's not particularly likely date. It's more likely that it's very early in 48 AD. He hears bad news from Galatia. He writes off Galatians off to Galatia because he's going to a council in Jerusalem. He can't get back and visit them straight away. So probably early March, maybe just possibly late February. That seems a little bit early. Paul is writing Galatians, but we're talking not just the year, we're talking about which time of the year. 1 Corinthians 55 AD, he's written it from Ephesus just before he leaves, and he says he's going to leave at Pentecost. So just before Pentecost in 55 AD. 1 Timothy, Paul has decided to spend the winter. It's the winter of 62 to 63 AD, but he hasn't decided where yet. and he writes to Timothy. Timothy's going to come and visit him. So we know that it's written late on in the year as the traveling season comes to an end in 62 AD. So we can place a lot of the books very, very precisely, when it comes to the letters anyway, into the date of this period after the resurrection of Jesus. Let's use that to place Acts. Well, first of all, the thing about Acts is that historically it's very accurate. It describes a huge number of little different towns, journeys from one town to another. It talks about water courses, voyages by sea, all sorts of details of geography, and it's accurate every time. Gets the titles of the governors, the rulers of the cities, not always governors, correct. Those titles varied hugely from one place to another. Not only that, they've changed from time to time, and Luke gets it right every time. Acts is remarkable in its historical accuracy. But it ends in a rather strange way. Talking about Paul, he's arrived in Rome, and it says he lived there 2 whole years at his own expense. And he says he proclaimed the kingdom of God and talked about Jesus. But that's the last 2 verses of the book of Acts. That's the end of it. And it ends with nothing. There's no picture of what's going to happen next. There's no picture of the future. If you read the Gospel of Luke, also written by the same man, you find it gives you a very quick view of what's going to happen at the start of Acts. Acts refers back to what happens at the end of Luke. But there's nothing on at the end of Acts. You don't know, was Paul released? Did he stay in prison? Well, it turns out he was released, but it doesn't tell you that in Acts. What about people like James? James died. He was persecuted. He was killed in 62 AD later on. And we know when Paul arrived in Rome. He arrives in 60 AD. It says he spent 2 years. So we're talking right at the beginning of 60 AD. So this is now right at the beginning of 62 AD. And at the beginning of 62 AD, Acts reaches an abrupt end with no idea what's going to happen next. And the only real way you can explain that, why do you end something when it's not a proper event? It's because that's when Acts was actually published. So we can put Acts in early on in 62 AD, just before Paul is released and goes on another journey. Luke. Well, if you look in Acts, you've got to reference the book of Luke. It's the first book, so it's written before the book of Acts is written. And there's a reference to it in 1 Timothy. So Timothy quotes scripture, and he quotes 2:1, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. That's from the Old Testament. That was written long before. And also, the laborer deserves his wages. And that saying's reported in Matthew and in Luke, but it probably was originally given in Aramaic, and there are different words in Greek used by the 2 different people translating it into Greek. This is the Luke version. So Luke's gospel is quoted in 1 Timothy. We dated 1 Timothy already to 62 AD. So Luke's gospel must have been written before 62 AD. So that's 2 reasons. Before Acts, that's 62 AD. And before 1 Timothy was written. So we've got a latest date for the Gospel of Luke. Acts was written right at the earliest possible time in 62 AD. So probably Luke can't be written much after the end of 61 AD. So it's putting it, latest possible date is the end of 61 AD. And you've got to say, well, how early could it be written? And fairly recently, Wenham has said he thinks it must have been written before 1 Corinthians. I'm not sure I follow that argument myself. I think he's maybe making too much of the quotation he uses. I would put Luke a little later than that. But Luke arrives in Judea in 57 AD. We know that. It comes with the Apostle Paul. Got to have a bit of time to collect his information, but after that he could write a gospel. So anywhere between the start of 58 AD and the end of 61 AD, Luke could have been written. I tend to think it's the after Luke arrives in Rome, 61 or well, not 62, 60 or 61 AD. But it could have been a little bit earlier. So we've got a date for the Gospel of Luke. Okay, let's go on again now and think about Mark's Gospel. This is a little bit less certain than Acts and Luke, but if you look at in 1 Corinthians, it talks about things that the Corinthians should know. They should know that Jesus said this. There's some source they have access to, which includes certain sayings of Jesus. There are other things that Jesus doesn't say. And in fact, these correspond to what appears in the Gospel of Mark. Some of the things that they should know about are only reported in Mark's Gospel and not in any other. So there are several allusions to the Gospel of Mark, a written document which the Corinthians have, which contains things that are in Mark's Gospel and nowhere else. Now, that means that Mark was already written. It must have been written before 55 AD. And if you look, if you say, well, Mark, he got his information from Peter, he had to be with Peter at the time. If you look at when Mark was free and when Peter was free, they don't really both get free together until 50 AD. They were just possibly, if you were writing very early in the 30s after the resurrection, they might have been together in Jerusalem at that point. But after that, Peter leaves Jerusalem and he goes around, and then Mark goes with Paul to Cyprus. And during that period, that Peter and Mark are in different places, so Mark couldn't have written from Peter. So that leaves you somewhere between 50 and 55 AD. But it's got to have enough. There's enough time. There's got to be enough time for Mark to actually write his gospel. There's got to be enough time for the Corinthians to get hold of a copy of it. So probably it's more towards the center of that range rather than quite so broad as I've drawn it on the diagram there. John's Gospel, we've already seen it written before 70 AD, and it contains no reference to the Jewish war. If it's written in the middle of the Jewish war, you'd think there'd be some reference to it. So it's probably written before 66 AD. But John appears to know how Peter died, so it's after the start of the persecution. Well, the persecution starts probably the beginning of 65 or the end of 64. And the Jewish war starts in 66. So that really leaves you 65 and the starting part of 66. So John's fairly easy to place, and it's there at the end of what I think of as a New Testament period. And finally, Matthew, and Matthew really is the hardest one to date. Matthew is acting as a sort of reporter for the whole of the disciples. It doesn't have much of his own personal detail in there. There's some in there. See that when we start thinking about who the gospel writers are in another video, but it's quite hard to date it. But we did see it was written before 70 AD, so that gives us an end to it. And I personally like to think it was written after Luke. Reasons that well, we're already long enough, don't want to go into them. No reference to Jewish war, at least not as something that's going on at the time. So it looks as though Matthew's written before the war starts. If it's written after Luke, that puts it there at the end of the period. Again, people disagree with me. They put it earlier than I do. So Wenham puts it back somewhere around 40 or even earlier than that. Puts Mark in the 40s. He puts Matthew before Mark. Other scholars look at this and they place these Gospels earlier than I do. But I think there's good evidence that says this is the latest they could have been written. That's the important thing. So, quick summary of the dates we've got. We've got Matthew, certainly before 67 AD, 66 or earlier, and probably after 61 if Luke's written late. Mark we've got between 50 and 55, Luke between 58 and 61, and John between late 64 and 66. So we've got a set of dates there, and for good measure we can throw in Acts as a very early 62 AD and quite easy to date. And we did look at a few of the letters. So I've put the three up that we did: Galatians, 1 Corinthians, 1 Timothy. Put 2 Timothy in there as well, because I think that's the last of Paul's letters to be written in the autumn of 63, unless he wrote Hebrews, of course, in which case it would be very late in 63 or possibly early in 64. So putting them on a diagram, that's what it looks like. There's the Jewish war there. These are the Gospels. The resurrection is down there, 30 AD. Think how that fits the life of the apostles. Peter is certainly alive well before 30 AD, off the edge on that side, and he probably dies in the persecution which follows on from the fire of Rome. So he's dead before John's Gospel is written, and he might be dead before Matthew's written, though probably not. John, though, is a much longer lived apostle. He carries on into the reign of Trajan. Traditionally, he's supposed to have died in 100 AD. It might have been a 98. Trajan doesn't come to the throne in 100. He comes a couple of years earlier. But and John dies in his reign. But John lasts right the way through the period. And other apostles also would be able to live on past 70 AD. They didn't all die the day after the resurrection. They kept on going, and they remembered things, and they would be a good check on what was going on. So if you were Peter and someone wrote a letter in your name and you're still alive, it wasn't you that wrote it, you'd be complaining. If you were Matthew and someone wrote a gospel in your name and it wasn't you, you'd be complaining. So what we've got is something where apostles alive, eyewitnesses, would be able to check what was being written in the Gospels and what was being spread to Christians around the world. So the fact that these Gospels are written early, first of all, it means that the people who wrote them would be able to talk to eyewitnesses, and they might be eyewitnesses themselves. But secondly, it means that they could definitely talk to the apostles, who were definitely eyewitnesses, and they could check with them, and the apostles had the authority to say this is not the real thing if it wasn't. So the fact that these Gospels and Acts and the letters were endorsed by the apostles shows their early date. So this argument works really nicely for the Gospels. Interestingly, it doesn't work for the Revelation, because that's talking about things in the future, so that could be later. But the Gospels, Acts, the letters, they're all here in this early part of the New Testament period. They're all written before the destruction of Judea and Galilee that happened in the war 66 to 73 AD. The apostles were alive when the Gospels were written. So how does that fit our dates? Well, there's no evidence to support the dates for the radical skeptics. There's no evidence that supports the compromise dates, but there's plenty of evidence that supports the early dates. The apostles were alive when the Gospels were written, and their authority is there behind the Gospels. They were eyewitnesses. They were committed to putting forward the message of Jesus, so we can trust the Gospels and what they say. I hope you enjoyed that. If you do, you might like to hit the like button. It's been thoughtfully provided by YouTube so that you know what to do if you like it. We've got a website, and of course we're producing videos on this channel every week. So if you subscribe, you'll be able to find them easily. If you notify, you'll find them even more easily. And thank you very much for listening, and may God bless you always.